I want to jump to this story here. We have this clip from the Joe Rogan Experience. Jack Posobiec says, breaking, Joe Rogan says there was real fraud in the Kari Lake election. The context beyond this is a story from the Daily Mail that finds 69% of Republicans believe that Biden, his win was illegitimate and that there was widespread fraud. But let's play this clip first. We got Patrick Bet David, he rocks, and Joe Rogan, also very great.
How much election fraud do you think is real?
Here we go, Joe. You want to go to election fraud?
Yeah, because I don't think it's zero.
No,
it's
no
not
way.
Zero. I think we could all agree it's not zero.
No way it's not zero.
And we know that these voting machines can be fucked with.
Yeah.
And we know that there's some irregularities, all that Kari Lake stuff in Arizona that they're trying to dismiss. It doesn't look like that's invalid. It looks like there's real fraud there. It looks like there's some real shenanigans there. At the very least, there was voting machines that weren't working properly, and it seems very suspicious that a lot of them were in Republican areas. There's a lot of shenanigans. And I think there's coordinated efforts to make sure that certain people get elected. I don't know how far they go, but I know it's not zero.
He's right. It is not zero. Even Bill Barr said it wasn't zero. And that's the big question. 69% of Republicans think there was widespread fraud and Biden did not win. So there was a tweet. It was Robbie Starbuck put out a poll saying, do you think we're in a civil war? And of course, you all know how I voted in that poll. But the overwhelming majority of people said yes. There were 4 choices. One was no, we're not. And then one was not yet, but soon. And that was the second most voted position. So here's the way I'll frame it. And I guess I've said this before. It all depends on where we go next. If Donald Trump is cleared of all charges, SCOTUS says these charges are politicking and weaponizing the Justice Department. Trump ends up winning. Trump fires a handful of people. There's some reforms. It's a little tumultuous, but mostly we move past it. No one will ever talk about this as a civil war or a revolution or a conflict. They'll just say, there was a rough patch. If it does escalate beyond where we are now, not just today, but probably January 6th, probably 2016 will be considered the second Civil War period. So 50, 100 years from now, if whatever is happening now does break out into hot conflict or totalitarianism or something, they'll write. The conflict all started in 2015 when the Clinton campaign falsely accused her chief rival of being a spy working for the Russian government. And that kicked off a chain of events, which resulted in impeachments, street battles.
I think for
January
sure
6th.
It'll go back to September 11th and the Patriot Act. If it gets to this is the time of history where the United States ended, it will be remembered that stupid bill that let you throw people in jail with no cause.
But that's
the reason. That's where it all began.
They won't say that. That's reductive.
They better.
When we look at the Civil War period, you could bring up Bleeding Kansas, but nobody considers that the Civil War. They consider it like a component of pre-Civil War. And then if you go back a couple decades to what was it? I think the 1850s, the Catching Slaves Act or whatever, was a big catalyst because the bill was basically if slaves escaped to the South to the North would have to return them.
The Fugitive Slave Act.
Fugitive Slave Act. And the North said, you got it. The bill was passed. And then the North said, yeah, right, we're not doing that. So the South was basically saying, if the federal government passes laws the North will not adhere to, what is the point of a federal government? It does nothing.
Yep. And
but we don't go back and say it all started here with the Fugitive Slave Act. No, we say it was a component, and people will consider 9/11 as a component. But the Civil War period, I believe, likely it theoretically has a bunch of components that lead into with Occupy Wall Street, the Great Recession.
Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, it was demoralizing, destabilizing for the United States. It bankrupted our country.
But the shift was 2015.
I wouldn't define a civil war unless there was. When I say violence, I guess I don't mean just Black Lives Matter violence or Antifa violence. I would call it if there's conflict violence, like a hot war. I would describe what we're in right now as a cultural revolution, which can be a precursor to a hot war. It can be a precursor to a civil war. I voted in that poll too, and I voted not yet, but soon, kind of like TBD, ...
Cultural revolution just means one side's not fighting back.
That's exactly what's happening, yeah.
I mean, because, whenever people say we're not in a civil war because there's no hot conflict yet, I'll just say Aaron Danielson was shot twice in the chest by a guy with a Marxist tattoo, with a BLM tattoo on his neck. Yeah, you're just not paying attention to it. there's been a ton of violence. The BLM riots was a major component of whatever this cultural civil war or cultural revolution is. And yeah, perhaps it is just a revolution, a communist revolution.
I like that cultural revolution.
That's what I think is happening.
It's the same thing that Mao did. It's in the 50s. It's the same thing. The whole dividing people into the left and the right is that what Mao did to create a cultural revolution so that then you can pull the tail on one of the dogs and they start chasing each other and you're the crazy monkey that gets to watch.
This is what the first half of my book is about. So like, when we see all these crazy things, like we just describe it as like, oh, our culture's in chaos, or we're watching critical race theory and trans ideology being indoctrinated into our kids. And I'm like, okay, why is this all happening at the same time? I mean, I know that Republicans don't fight back, so maybe they just thought it was an easy in, but this seems like a concerted effort. How did we get here? Yeah, how did we get here? And it turns out, as I looked into this, the answer to that is less of a why and more of a who. As I researched it, I found the people and the organizations behind each of the attacks on all these cultural institutions, and they are invariably Marxists. I mean, even the Black Lives Matter movement that you just mentioned, I mean, this is the obvious one. People are familiar with this, but the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement are openly Marxists. They brag about being trained Marxists. You see all these books. I mean, I see you have Genderqueer sitting here on the table. I mean, the president of the American Library Association is a self-avowed Marxist. These people are actual communists, actual Marxists, and they are using the destabilization of our cultural institutions, the civil institutions, to get us to economic destabilization so that they can topple our government. That is the definition of a cultural revolution. People are just like, whoa, communist, Marxist, like it's just Republican versus Democrat. And if you actually peel back the layers and look at who's behind this, it's not a coincidence. It's not chaos. It's actual Marxism.
Hey, why do you think they embraced Marxism?
I think that they are ideological Marxists. I think Marxism is we think of it economically. When we think of Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto, we think of the working class overthrowing the ruling class. And I think that didn't really work. It never caught on to become the global revolution that they wanted. So it sort of died out. But then Antonio Gramsci, he was this Italian Marxist, founder of the Italian Communist Party, or co-founder, said, well, listen, if you observe the cultural revolutions that were successful, or these Marxist revolutions, they started culturally. First, you overtake the civil institutions that the working class rely on to destabilize society, and then they're willing to actually revolt against the ruling class. Like, the root of all of this is economically, they're anti-capitalist. And then many, if you analyze the Marxist or the communist ideology, there's a spiritual aspect of it too. I mean, the United States is being targeted because we are fundamentally a Christian nation built on Christian morals, built on Judeo-Christian morals, and Marxists can't stand that.
Can you explain the difference between communism and Marxism?
Yeah, it's essentially the same thing. It's just a specific version of it. So communism is this false idea that there can be collective ownership of everything, that there's no private property, there's no one person in charge. It's just everybody owns everything. Marxism is the tool to achieve that. So Marxism pits one class against another, one saying that, the working class is oppressed. They are oppressed by the ruling class. And in order to achieve communism, Marxism is the revolutionary tactic. That's why it's important, I think, to differentiate between communism and the Marxists that are behind the Cultural Revolution here, because they are trying to destabilize our society using that tactic to achieve communism.
So there could be other tactics to achieve communism than Marxism, including perhaps economic technocracy. Something where we're all the same in a machine. Yeah.
Technocracy is. So that's actually really interesting. I have a whole chapter in my book about technocracy, because technocracy is ruled by the experts, right? Like you can't question Fauci because Fauci is the technocrat. The root of technocracy can be traced all the way back to French socialists and Russian Marxists who were part of the Bolshevik Revolution. There was a Russian Marxist who actually described technocracy as a stepping stone from capitalism to communism. Because this was always the problem for communists and Marxists, right? People aren't just going to wake up one day and be like, oh, cool, we live in a free society. Yes, I'd love to have communism. There has to be some frog in a pot of boiling water moment in a culture where people are slowly introduced, incrementally into communism. Technocracy is a stepping stone for that. That's why we see it with the administrative state. We see it with Fauci. We see it with, once you have kids, you see this all the time in, the pediatrician industry. You as a parent aren't allowed to question anything, from breastfeeding to co-sleeping to vaccines. You have to defer to the experts. It's everywhere. And it's conditioning people not to question, not to dissent, just to obey, which is the communist way.
Are there historically examples of nations or people going towards that communist route and then stopping and saying, hell no, realizing what's happening and turning
Civil
around?
wars break out.
Has it ever been a peaceful regurgitation?
I think it's probably hard to cite examples because it wouldn't be documented as a significant moment if it just reversed itself and never really went that way.
It's a good question, though, because it's kind of a chilling question if you think about it. If we can't sit here and name a cultural revolution that headed or that was trying to transform a free society to a communist society, it means that often it wasn't stopped. It either wasn't significant enough or it wasn't stopped. Because the examples that I can think of are examples that took a relatively free or relatively religious society and turned it into oppression, tyranny, and death.
There's the inverse. There's Spain. The communists and the Republicans or the nationalists were fighting, and then it was the right that won that one.
And same in Germany. The Nazis destroyed the communists.
The Nazis, I mean, one of the principal components of their propaganda was to fight communism. Yeah, the Bolsheviks. Yep. Mm-hmm.
I believe there's a way to do it peacefully with this technology, but I mean, it's owned by the technocrats, so I don't know how that works. I'd like to say what I think online, guys. Sorry.
That goes back to what I was saying before about like the augmented reality. That's why I don't consider myself a cynic. I do consider myself a skeptic because I don't trust these people. I don't trust the like AI. People always talk about AI being this like sentient being, this like this thing that can take over and think for itself. And I'm like, no, somebody is behind writing the algorithms of all of those things. And that somebody is someone whose ideology is very different than ours, who wants to use that to influence the way that we or our children or whoever think so that they can convince those people to act in certain ways that benefit their political ideology.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. Hang out with us live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. and become a member over at timcast.com for uncensored, members-only shows exclusive. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.